Dr. Melanie Smallman is a lecturer in Science and Technology Studies and the co-director of University College London's Responsible Research and Innovation Hub. She's also the founder and director of the UK first science communication consultancy, ThinkLab, and has led a number of innovative science communication and science policy projects. Dr. Smallman has a PhD in Science and Technology Studies from University College London, an MS in Science Communication from Imperial College London, and a BS in Microbiology and Virology from the University of Warwick. She's a former fellow for the Science, Technology and Society program at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, was appointed a fellow of the Royal Society of Art in 2016, and is currently a fellow at the Alan Turing Institute. I'm super excited to have Melanie here. We have, hopefully we will work together in the future, and hopefully we can have a great conversation today. So please join me virtually in welcoming Melanie. Melanie, you have the stage.
Thank you. Well, yeah, thanks for having me. And I'm sorry that I didn't actually make it across the sea to see you. It would be much nicer to be there in person. The first challenge is for me to share my slides. So let me just share the screen. Here we go. Fantastic. So this is not the most exciting slide, so it possibly wasn't worth waiting for. Okay. What I am going to talk about is some work that I did. It was 4 or 5 years ago, and it was about 3 years worth of research where I was looking at how the public talk about science and comparing that to how policymakers and scientific experts talk about science. So if you go to the next slide, to just give some background, because I think the context is slightly different in the UK to the US, but in the sort of from the 70s, 80s, 90s, there were a lot of groups, the civil society organizations that were protesting about various things like nuclear power, anti-climate change protesters, anti-GM protesters. And the British governments and the kind of scientific community saw this as some sort of opposition to science and technology, which needed to be brought around. So the problem was very much the public's perception of technology, and that we needed to solve this problem by helping people see things otherwise. So next slide. The kind of response to these sort of protests were that what we needed to do was what we've called the move from deficit to dialogue. So the argument was that people had these views because they were deep-seated values, and that there was probably the thing that was important in solving this would be to involve citizens in policy discussions around science, so that the answer wasn't to sort of shove information down their throats, but to actually get them involved in discussions about science, to try and change the shape and the trajectory that science was taking, in the hope that or in the belief that that would actually change how people think about science. And so in the UK, there was over 10 years, there was a series of government-funded participatory exercises about different scientific subjects. So, I mean, I won't say much about what I think of that as a solution to the problem, but this was the solution to the problem. I think my illustration with the chairs is sort of the gist of what I think about it, is that it's kind of insufficient. But the focus, so this argument was made that we should have these participatory exercises, but when these took place, the focus tended to be very much on the process, so the arrangement of the chairs quite literally, rather than what was discussed. And from my perspective, it seemed that understanding what people say in those discussions has to be important if you want to understand whether it's shaping policy. But also, I just thought that it was a staggeringly huge source of data for those of us who are interested in how people come to think and understand science. So 10 years of quite deep, thoughtful discussions with groups of the public. And at the point when I started looking at this, nobody was particularly interested in what was said. They were all talking about, you know, who was in charge, what kind of room was it in, and these sort of strange, to me, strange questions. So if we move on. For me, they were kind of, I set out to answer 3 questions. So first, looking at these accounts of these debates, how do people talk about science and technology? How does that differ from the way experts or scientists talk about it? And what does that mean for policymakers? And I should add that before I was an academic, I spent 8 years working within the UK government, and I was kind of on the receiving end of some of these things and was sort of conscious of why some of these views and comments and debates might not get much traction within policy. So I was kind of interested to do it from an academic perspective. Okay, so the next slide. I looked at reports. So there were 3 sets of documents to look at. There were reports from these UK government funded public dialogue events. There was 10 years worth of them. There's more now. Most of these discussions, and you know what I mean by a dialogue event, it's like a citizens' jury, kind of a formally organised kind of set piece participatory exercise, so a mini public, I think they call it in some circles. And each one of those typically fed into an expert, either fed into an expert analysis. So one of the like the Royal Society or one of the academies would be holding an expert inquiry into it, and these public things would feed into them, or they would go alongside those into the government, and the government was making policy. So there were 3 sets of views expressed around the same subject round about the same time. There were these public reports, there were these scientific expert reports, and there were government policy reports. So this was kind of my starting point. So the next slide. So I had these 3 corpuses, 18 public reports, 12 expert reports, 11 policy reports, and they looked across the topic, so across the full spectrum of scientific topics. And so, I mean, this isn't a massive data set, but it was a reasonable data set. And also because I'd worked on some of these, I wanted a kind of cooler lens on it. So I used computer assisted text analysis software, which I'm happy to talk about more if anyone is particularly interested in it. But basically what it does is it produces lists of words that are commonly found together in sentences. And I, as a researcher, use these lists of words to interpret what the discourses are within the text. So I make sense of the text by looking at the kind of statistical map of words in that text, if that makes sense. So the next slide, I also used, I don't know if people are familiar with this, I used the theoretical concept of sociotechnical imaginaries. And this is an idea that Jasnov and Kim first came up with in about 2008. And what they've intriguingly described them as collectively imagined forms of social life and social order that are reflected in the design and fulfillment of nation-specific scientific or technological projects. So it's kind of what they're talking about with these is the underlying vision of how science works within society and the kind of things we're trying to do with science when we make policy or when we fund it. And so what my idea was is that if I could look at the discourses within text with this computer software, that would reveal to me the underlying imaginaries, the underlying socio-technical imaginaries, and I could see if the basic gist of what the different groups thought science was doing in the world was the same or different. Hopefully that makes sense. So the next slide, just keeping an eye on my clock. So yeah, so I took the text of the reports, I did the computer assisted text analysis to come up with a series of discourses, and I looked at each so I looked at the public reports together, the policy reports together, and the scientific reports together, produced a set of discourses in each one, which I then read to interpret these socio-technical imaginaries, which I then compared. Okay, I'll say it'll become clearer when I say what I found. Okay, the next slide. Yeah, so, and again, the next one. In terms of what we found with the public, so this is what the computer, this sort of dendrogram is what the computer software comes out with, and these are like the first 5 words in each class. So basically, each class is kind of a cluster of words that happen statistically significantly occur together. The list is usually several hundred, but it would be a really dull slide. But basically, this is kind of what I've interpreted, and this is what I get. And sort of the only thing that's interesting and worth saying on this slide is that you can see that some of the classes are more closely related to others. So the red one, class 1 at the top, was the first one to come out, and that's very different to the other classes, whereas perhaps the yellow and green ones are more closely related because they were only found at the last split in the tree, if that makes sense. Any statisticians, that will hopefully make more sense than I've just explained. Okay, so I'll just, what I want to do is just talk through these classes because I think the public ones are probably more interesting. Then I'll quickly talk about the policy and the scientific classes to flag up the key differences between these, and then yeah, then we can talk about it. Okay, so if we go to the next slide. Oh, and there's something missing there. Is there another click? Ah, yes. So the first sort of discourse that came out of the public documents was this one about drugs, and this quoted sentence I made up. So this is a sentence that's been, I call it a synthetic sentence that I've made up based on the words in that class. So this is not found in any of the documents, but it's typical of what people would say based on the words that are in this class. So this one is about drugs. It's based on one dialogue report. So there was one dialogue about the use of drugs and about what are they called, mind enhancing drugs. And it was, they were struggling to try and make sense about whether this was a sensible thing to be doing or not. They were very concerned, lots of talk about whether it was fair for these neuroenhancers to be used, whether it raised issues about equality. Talked a lot about, well, you know, if you use drugs, you're not really tackling the underlying social problems, but it kept things very open. It didn't decide whether drugs were good and whether these neuroenhancers were a good idea or not. They were sort of keeping it open, thinking we need a bit more talk on this one. Okay, so the next slide. This one is about, oh, and can you click again? I didn't know I'd done that. Sorry, right, that's annoying. So this class is about, this is the biggest class and the most positive one, and it's about medical technology, so medical aspects of nanotechnology, synthetic biology, and stem cells specifically. It's enthusiastic about the science, but also tempering it with downsides. So being aware that there may be risks or it may be open to exploitation. But what it was talking about was how can we maximize the benefits and minimize the risks without actually putting a halt on the science. Industry is talked about in this one, but it's seen very much as potentially distorting, so driving biomedical research towards profit making, and that this is something which the government needs to control and make sure that that doesn't happen. Okay, next slide. And this one was related to, so this is the second biggest one. It was more negative and skeptical than the one about biomedical science. And this was relating to kind of environmental technologies. So geoengineering, nanotechnology, energy, and climate change. This was very much talking about the concept of a moral hazard. So the idea that if we do this, there may be consequences. We may be on a track that we can't come back from. And it talks about technologies being uncontrollable and unpredictable. and nature and the environment is really important here, and talked about very much as a system. So this kind of quite an environmentalist perspective, and this idea of Mother Nature being in harmony and technology upsetting that harmony. Okay, the next one. Yeah, the fourth one, the slippery slope. And this again, this one was those kind of technologies, I don't know how you describe them, but they kind of fit together in my mind, about genetically modified food, biotechnology, synthetic biology. So these kind of technologies that mess with genes and are quite sort of touching fundamental things. And again, there was this real sense that science was out of control. So words like the slippery slope, we don't know where this is going, it's the thin end of the wedge. These were terms that came up time and time again in these. Natural was again talked about, but nature was talked about. I can't see what I said on my slide now. I think, what is it? Can anyone see what's under nature as a law? Is this the one? It was a sort of a way of
you can actually move those little things on the side if you want
them. Yes, I can move them. Thank you. There's a law. I was right. I know my own slides. Right, I'll just move you over a little bit. There you go. Sorry. Yeah, so it was a very different conception of nature. Whereas the first one, they were talking about it as a system and a balance. This is about a law that shouldn't be transgressed in a way, you know, if you don't follow the laws of nature, then there'll be trouble. And this sense of science being out of control. And safety was a really, really important concept in this, and as a condition for public acceptance. So we can only live with these technologies if you can show us that they're safe, which is a whole can of worms for the philosophers amongst us. Okay, so the next slide, I think, is the last class. Yes. So, this is interesting. So again, this was about talking about, there were some dialogues which were about human embryos. So work to produce animals containing human material, hybrid embryos and stem cells. So this was particularly relating to these kind of genetic developmental biology human things. And it was very much about where the line should be drawn. So what is okay and what isn't. But what was interesting in drawing that line, it was not talking about law or regulation or governance. It was entirely about morals and about moral boundaries. And in this instance, again, nature was really, really important, but nature was being talked about in terms of how a boundary is drawn. So something is natural or it's not natural, and if it's not natural, it's morally wrong. It was absolutely clear to them that this natural, not natural was where the right and wrong boundary lies. Yeah, and they were kind of struggling to decide where this line should be drawn, because it was clear that the technologies could help, particularly with, you know, horrible illnesses and diseases that were talked about in the workshop. But at the same time, there was kind of an emotional response to this, and this sense of it not being natural and therefore not being right, which I think that resonates with lots of things we've heard about this. Okay, the next slide. Yes, so do you want to just click them all on? I don't know, I think there's 5 or 6. Thank you. There you go. I think just sort of bringing those key points together from the public discourses, the really important things are that, so in the past, people have said that it's not that people have, so academics have said that it's not that people have views of science per se, they have views of particular technology. So you need to take each technology or each science one by one and deal with them as separate things. But that wasn't what I was seeing. So what's really clear is that people are grouping technologies, and particular types of technologies are eliciting particular views amongst the public. So, you know, it's possible to kind of group and maybe even predict how people will respond to things on the basis of that. Throughout the discourses, the language was very much focused on people, not technology. So they talked about how they felt and what it meant to people rather than describing the technologies. It was a positive, overall, they were positive discourses. People felt a sense of progress and potential. This is all awful, but there was also an unease mixed in with that. And the social and ethical issues were just discussed as being inherent to the technology. So there wasn't a separate discussion. The class didn't, a discourse around social and ethical issues didn't appear. They were intertwined in those conversations about technologies and whether how they can be used and whether that should be right. Okay, so the next slide. Yeah. Oh, that last point is important, that they didn't, that's okay, that they didn't reach a firm conclusion. So it was very much keeping the issues open and waiting to see. And to my reading, a lot of these discussions were actually people talking things through and trying to work out what they think about it by talking about it and talking it through with the other people in their group. So they didn't reach a conclusion. It was kind of a work in progress. Okay, so the next slide. So just sort of based on that reading of those discourses, I described this public socio-technical imaginary as, oh, I hate this title. So if anyone could come up with something better, they win a prize. I've called it contingent progress, which is such an academic term. And basically, what I'm saying they would say, so typical of this kind of imaginary, is we need science to cure things like cancer and climate change, but we must be careful that industry doesn't distort the focus. Some risks are worth taking, particularly in medical science, but we also need more research and information before we can be sure that we won't be taking risks that cause more problems by creating more unfairness, breaking the laws of nature, or challenging what it is to be human. So it's kind of a proceed with caution sort of message. Okay, so the next slide, I'm going to go quite quickly through these. So I've used the term experts. What I mean is scientists, actually, because they were branded as experts, but in most cases, these reports were produced by the great and the good in British science. So the thing that's kind of interesting in this, so it produced 5 different discourses, which the thing that I want to point out actually on this slide that's important is this class 1, where the words were things like public, issue, ethical, nanotechnologies, dialogue. Because the other classes, as I'll show you, were very technical. And I think they saw their job in these reports as kind of selling the science and briefing the policymakers on the science. But there was one distinct class that came out that was pulled out from all of the reports, and that's this class 1, which we'll look at. I think it's on the next slide. Yeah. So completely differently to how the public discourses were shaped, in the expert discourses, there was this particular place where social and ethical issues were discussed. So these concerns, these social and ethical issues, were seen as very distinct to the technology. So this class was made from across all of the reports, and the language was so different that it stood out on its own. And it's about responding to concerns raised in public dialogue. So the public was seen as raising concerns. That was their job, is to flag up this list of things which they're worried about. And then it was the job of the scientists to say that it's all fine and don't worry about it. So there was a tendency to really close this debate down and say, there's nothing to see here, don't worry about it, you know, this is all fine. And to me, this just stands out very starkly, that it's this separate discourse devoted to social and ethical issues outside the context of how the technologies develop and are used. So I'm just going to skim through the next few because they're not that interesting for the story. So there was a class about GM, and it was about, you know, reassuring people that it's fine, don't worry about GM, we've done this before, trust us, we're scientists. The next one, the next slide, similarly about brain science, you know, we can fix all those problems. Don't worry about it. It's going to be fine. Yeah. Yeah, next one. Yeah. Similarly, talk about stem cells. This class was all about, I've called it the biomedical science bit, because this is all about explaining the nuts and bolts of how stem cells work, and, you know, basically saying you have to let us do this because stem cells are actually going to cure cancer and Parkinson's disease. So we can say more about that later, whether that's true or not, but that was very much the discourse that the scientists were putting to the policymakers. So right, the next one is the last one. Yeah, and so there was this last discourse as well that was also drawn from across all of the reports. And it was arguing that if we invest in the right aspect of technologies, the UK will become much more competitive in the global market. So it was really clearly framing this science. We can do this science, we can address the public's worries, and we can make loads of money for you and make you internationally competitive. So let's just do this, okay? So those are kind of the gist of the expert classes. And to me, this isn't particularly surprising. This is how I hear scientists talk all of the time, is that it's not a problem with the science or the technology, it's how we use it. We can deal with that, we can manage risk, we can measure, and we can reduce risk. Everything will be fine, and we're going to make lots and lots of money, and it's going to be really good. So I've called, if we go to the next slide, yeah, the key points, yeah, it's super positive. It uses really technical language and focuses on the science. That point for me really, really stood out, that these social and ethical issues really stand away much more than in the public discourse. Yeah, okay, that's fine. Yeah, so I mean, these 3 and 4 points are really important. Apart from the separation, there was this talk about managing risk and closing down concerns. So we can measure with more research, we can make GM technology much safer, and the things people are worried about will go away, and we can manage the risk of anything uncertain with more research. And those 2 points just really contrasted quite strongly for me with the public discourses, because, you know, the public were talking about the thin end of the wedge, things out of control, you know, yeah, very much more about losing control and about risk not really being manageable. So this, you know, this clear tension between a public that sees science as a bit wild and unmanageable, and scientists quite the opposite, saying that it can all be fine, just give us more money and it'll all be fine, trust us. Okay, and I mean, perhaps none of this is surprising. Maybe it shouldn't be, but it was. Okay, next slide is, I sort of brought these expert discourses down to this kind of expert sociotechnical imaginary that I've called Science to the Rescue, which typically I think is summed up with: science has the potential to make the UK economy stronger and more competitive in the global market and address the big issues ahead, like curing cancer and solving climate change. The public has some concerns about social and ethical issues associated with new technologies, but we can address those with more research and information. So I kind of felt there was this real contrast there between this public that wasn't negative, but was measured and saying, we need to think about this, we're not sure, let's see, and it depends. And this really kind of gung-ho scientists, we can solve these problems and everything can be solved with enough research and enough brain power. Very much, you know, what you hear coming out of Silicon Valley, I guess. So the next slide, I'm pressing my button on, isn't it? So next slide, yeah. In terms of what the policymakers said, I mean, the gist is that the policymakers said almost the same things as the scientists. So if you strip out that technical talk of explaining what stem cells are and how GM crops work, it was very, very similar. That, I mean, the stuff about GM was particularly important, and there was some talk about regulation, but overall, really, the way that things were talked about, the way that technology was talked about was very, very similar to how the scientists talked about it. So in particular, things like, you know, there was this view that if we manage risk and that risk is manageable, we can get the benefits from science. There was, again, no separate, yeah, the social, sorry, if we go to the next slide, I can say a bit more. Yeah, I mean, so I mean, this was quite interesting. So a whole class about GM, the British government was obsessed by genetically modified crops at the time. And this whole class is about how this is going to develop without upsetting the public. And the public concern, genuine concerns that were expressed in the dialogue, were not really seen as ethical or moral concerns, but actually ones about safety and about consumer choice, and therefore there to be addressed, just waiting for more science to be addressed. Okay, so I mean, the next slide. Yeah, I'm going to just skip through the policy ones because I don't think they're quite as interesting. Yeah, and the next one, yeah. So I mean, just checking that I didn't miss anything. I'm sorry, I'd skipped through that because I think that it's less interesting than the public, and I think there's a lot more to say about the comparison. Yeah, to me, the shape of the policy discourses were much closer to those of the scientists. The thrust was to make sure that technological development could happen. Social and ethical issues were seen as something to be addressed rather than inherent to the technology, but matters that the public raise and that they need to be addressed somewhere else. Problems weren't seen as kind of moral or ethical problems. They were much more about risks or issues that need to be regulated, that can be dealt with either science or through law. So dealing with these was still seen as very much an expert thing, even though raising them was seen very much as a public thing. And of course, the position of the economy was seen as a key reason for driving this forward, for the main reason for funding science. So I've argued that this really, the underlying socio-technical imaginary, is again science to the rescue. It's basically, you know, with some differences in focus because of who the authors are. Policy are going to focus on regulation and policy. Scientists are going to focus on science and the nuts and bolts of things. But underneath this, there's a shared vision that with enough research and enough thought and enough risk management, science can solve all of our problems. So the next slide, I think, is a table. I'm keeping an eye on the time because I'm coming to the end. I'm conscious that we need time for discussion. Yeah, so this just sort of really puts this together, these points that I've just made, is that, you know, the public are much more focused on people, the experts in policy, science and economics. The key things, you know, really these social and ethical issues are seen as inherent to the science for the public, whereas they're things which can be dealt with elsewhere for experts and policymakers. Uncertainty and unforeseeable consequences of science just are seen as how science works for the public, whereas experts and policy groups see this much more about risk management and balancing interests. Yeah. And I mean, I don't know if you know this work, but it seems to me that Beck and Giddens' work, where Beck and Giddens' work on the Risk Society, where they describe sort of older previous views of risk as being external risk that can be managed and governed, and the situation in the world we're currently living in as manufactured uncertainty and these kind of reflexive problems where risk is produced as risk is the result of acts and technologies designed to manage risk is much more where that public perspective seems to be, which perhaps interestingly is a much more sophisticated understanding of the place of science in the world than that given by the experts and policymakers. Okay, so the next slide. Yeah, so I mean, I've summarized these, but I just wanted to show you, because I use this slide in talks a lot. So what I argued is that the scientists and policymakers share this elite socio-technical imaginary, and I use this picture, this lovely clip art of somebody jumping over the bridge. And this is, you know, this really captures it for me, is that it's seen as any problems to do with science. We're on this road to a great place, and any problems to do with science is this kind of gap in our knowledge that we can leap over as long as we put more research and more understanding in place, that we can carry on this road. Whereas the public, the next slide, I represent much more with this this rope or this string, where, you know, this isn't a gap. The social and ethical issues are really intertwined in with the technologies themselves, and if you were to pull them out, the rope would fall apart, it would lose its integrity. And so, you know, the public are just talking about completely different things. When they're talking about science and when they're expressing their concerns, they are not talking about the same thing. They've got this in their mind, whereas the scientists have got that in their mind. So you can see how, to me, I can see how misunderstandings crop up. So I think I've got 2 more slides before I'll start. I want to have a discussion. Yeah, I've said that, so we can move to the next slide. Yeah. So at the beginning, I was setting out to kind of look at both understand how the public talk about things, but also to understand why or whether these views might be problematic if they want to influence policy. And the conclusion I came to was that the public views do have limited impact on policy, and that's because they are presenting a very different socio-technical imaginary. So their sense of the world we are building and the place of science in that is very different to that of that in the heads of policymakers and scientists. And what happens is that that expert imaginary of this science to the rescue and the bridge we need to cross, that imaginary is acting as a filter, which is hearing complex and nuanced public discourses as being either lists of conditions that have to be complied with to get public acceptance, or discourses of resistance and ignorance. So they're mishearing quite interesting discussions. And on top of that, the machinery of policymaking just cannot accommodate that complex public imaginary. So there are no room for views that hold back economic development, and the structures that are in place and the rules of policymaking always give scientific evidence primacy. So my last slide, I think, yes. So I've written a lot more about the last 2 points. So the paper that I circulated in advance was covering the beginning, but the last 2 slides, what it means, I've written a lot more in this reference if anyone is interested, and should they, yeah, that's there. I mean, I'm happy if anyone can't access it, I'm happy to send that. But that's all I wanted to say. So thank you. I hope I didn't talk too fast.
This was great. Thank you so much, Melanie.